Thank you very much, John. Excellencies, dear friends and colleagues, I'd like to begin by joining others who have spoken before me in thanking the IISS and especially, of course, our host government, the government and people of Colombia, for their hospitality and the warm welcome that has been extended to all of us here in the beautiful city of Cartagena. May I also begin by paying tribute to the tremendous intellectual leadership that the IISS has shown over the years in promoting dialogue, in promoting cooperation in many parts of the world, not least in the Asia-Pacific, and through this meeting between Asia-Pacific and Latin America as well. I've been asked to speak this morning a little bit on the issue of an agenda for trans-Pacific cooperation. I believe this is a very timely and important subject matter, not least because of the geopolitical and the geo-economic shifts that we are seeing throughout the world, marked among others by the increasing prominence of countries of the Asia-Pacific and of course countries here in Latin America. And therefore, what we do as regions, the Pacific, Asia-Pacific, and Latin America, will have implications far beyond our own shores. It will have implications globally. And therefore, we have an opportunity here to get it right, and therefore making a meaningful impact on global developments. I'd like to begin with the thought that I had shared yesterday as well, in wanting to promote or identify a Pacific agenda. One must not be remiss of the already existing agenda and processes that is prevalent within our region. And in mentioning them now, I'm not trying to discourage further efforts in communications between the Pacific, Asia-Pacific, and Latin America, but simply wanting to place our current efforts in a wider context so that we ensure that there is a value-adding contribution that we will be making. I am most familiar, naturally speaking, of the various efforts that ASEAN has made in our part of the world, the so-called ASEAN-led processes or efforts that demonstrate ASEAN's centrality in architecture building in East Asia. All of you in this room, no doubt, are very familiar with the ongoing ASEAN community efforts that is now to be completed at the end of this year in 2015, after more than a decade of efforts, an ASEAN community in the economic domain, political security domain, as well as in the socio-cultural domain, an effort that has been consuming all countries in ASEAN. But beyond our own internal ASEAN efforts, ASEAN has at the same time been facilitating and initiating several processes, the so-called ASEAN Plus Ones, with China, with Korea, with Japan, Australia, and others, ASEAN Plus 3, the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Regional Forum, whether it be on political security issues and as well, not least, on economic and trade facilitation efforts. Many of you would be familiar, for example, with the current ongoing efforts on the regional comprehensive economic partnership that ASEAN is initiating with its dialogue partners, and which is also set to conclude or to make substantial progress by the end of this year. I am mentioning those again to illustrate how congested and how prolific is this type of architecture building efforts in the eastern part of our Pacific. Of course, beyond ASEAN, we are familiar with other processes, APEC, with its efforts to the promotion of the free trade for the Pacific idea, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and not least, we haven't spoken much about it, FEALAC, the Forum for East Asia and Latin America Cooperation, which, by the way, Colombia co-chaired with Indonesia just over 2 years ago now. So we have a tremendous amount of efforts. They all fulfill certain functions. They are product of certain period of time. And not least as well, we have many other inter-regional efforts, Asia, Europe, Asia, Africa, even all the way from 60 years ago, and many other processes. I mention those processes again, not to discourage, but rather to put matters in a wider context, so that our current efforts and our efforts at identifying the agenda for Pacific cooperation becomes a little bit more contextual. What kind of agenda are we to promote in Pacific cooperation? Just looking at the program of work over the past couple of days, we are very quickly come to awareness that there is actually a huge amount or scope where we can be collaborating and cooperating. Functional issues, economic, political, security. But how do we bring order to such a huge magnitude of possible topics for discussion? We have learned throughout the past 2 days of the Pacific Alliance perspective, and all of us are in agreement. It is a fantastic effort, and we wish to align ourselves with these efforts. But how do we bring order to this apparent, if we are not careful, a paradox of plenty? A lot of processes, but no clear benchmark for progress to be measured. I'd like to propose, by way of my own personal opinion, and based on the recognition, as I had said yesterday, there is actually a very close correlation and indivisibility between political security issues and economic issues. No one can pretend that the two issues are separated. I think, of course, we can make an effort to delineate agenda and topics as if they are divided, but the reality is, nowadays, economics and politics, national, local, national, regional, and global, they are all intertwined. Based on that premise, and based on that recognition, and not wanting to shy away from that reality, I'd like to propose a simple 2-point agenda for Trans-Pacific cooperation. It is, of course, a caricature, and at the risk of oversimplification of the kind of problems that we face and opportunities, but simple 2-point agenda. One is simply connectivity. Connectivity defined in a very broad manner. We have physical connectivity, of course. We have institutional connectivity and people-to-people connectivity. I chose this theme, connectivity, because it's something that is prevalent basically throughout all regional or sub-regional cooperation that we can think of in the Pacific. We certainly have it at the national level. All national governments are promoting efforts to strengthen their connectivity capacity. Sub-regional connectivity efforts in Southeast Asia, we have between Thailand, Indonesia, and Malaysia, between Indonesia, the Philippines, and Brunei. Southwest Pacific Dialogue among the Mekong River countries. ASEAN connectivity, there is even a blueprint for such an effort. In APEC connectivity, in East Asia Summit, and no doubt, I'm sure, in this neighborhood, there is also a strong connectivity efforts. So if we can have that as a guiding principle or organizing thought, then we can connect the missing dots. Because what we have now are probably connectivity efforts that are in isolation from one another. A Trans-Pacific dialogue can add value by connecting the outer dots. And this is certainly what Indonesia, through ASEAN, has been doing. National level, sub-regional level, ASEAN plus one, East Asia Summit, connectivity running through APEC, running through those efforts. The second theme or second cluster of agenda I'd like to propose is how can we promote a Pacific, meaning here a peaceful Pacific Ocean. I know, again, some of us may have different comfort level whether we should be discussing issue of political security issues here in this type of forum, or at least as a trans-Pacific agenda. But again, I believe that it's best that we recognize and confront this reality. After all, countries in the Pacific, we have all been beneficiaries of a peace dividend. The decades of peace in our region have enabled our countries to pursue economic development. We must ensure in the 21st century we have the right kind of peace framework and architecture for the promotion and consolidation of peace that is relevant for the world of today, not the world of post or during Cold War type of orientation. And I remember yesterday throughout the discussion, some were asking about the role of China, where to place Pacific Alliance and where we place ourselves in the kind of equation that we have. I sometimes feel that the kind of framework that we are adopting is still a very much either-or, zero-sum game type of relationship. Let me just illustrate this by some examples. In our part of the world, in East Asia, I believe that at the present time, the type of security challenge we are facing are at least of three forms. One is how we transform trust deficit into strategic trust. And throughout the course of our discussion today and yesterday, we have come back time and again on the issue of trust, whether it be at the national level, local level, regional, and global. In our part of the world, in East Asia, notwithstanding the proliferation of various confidence-building efforts, IRF and many others, actually, when all is said and done, there is still trust deficit, and there is a need for transformation to a strategic trust. The second issue in our region is territorial disputes. How can we manage, and even better still, resolve those disputes peacefully? And the third point is how do we manage change? The reality that countries become more prominent, how do we face this reality not as a problem, not as a challenge, but as an opportunity to be embraced by having the concept of common security, security as a common goods, not something to be enjoyed at the expense of the other. No doubt, the experience of Latin American countries can add to the kind of list of challenges that we face, internal challenges that we heard yesterday in a very eloquent session, in a very good session that we heard yesterday of the different situations faced by countries in East Asia and Latin America. Connectivity, and second, how do we promote peace in our region? ASEAN is an example. In the 60s, 70s, Southeast Asia was a region marked by open conflict, tensions, distrust. Yet, throughout its existence, ASEAN has transformed the situation, not by accident, but constant nurturing and investing in changing distrust to a strategic trust. ASEAN political security community, the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, the non-use of force among ASEAN. Over the recent years, the past Indonesian government have tried to infect, in a positive way, the ASEAN experience beyond Southeast Asia. We have the Bali principles of the East Asia Summit, non-use of force among countries of East Asia, peaceful settlements of disputes. I'd like to propose that countries of the Pacific, bearing in mind, it is, after all, supposed to be a Pacific geographical expanse, put our minds to having some kind of basic norms and principles of how we govern our relationship that can be good not only for today, but for years and decades to come. Those, John, are some of the thoughts that I wanted to share. Obviously, impossible in the limited time that we have to try to identify a coherent set of agenda for the Pacific cooperation, but trying to bring some kind of order to the wonderful, in a way, positive anarchy that we have, because the proliferation process is not something to be to be looked at negatively. But if we have to focus our efforts, I believe that those two themes, connectivity and promoting a Pacific Ocean, is something that may be worthwhile to promote in the future. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.